Ryan, welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today in the show, we have Joe Mandato and Ryan Van Wert. Joe is a venture capitalist. Ryan is a pulmonologist and healthcare executive. Together, they wrote a series of articles on Kevin MD, Why Healthcare Delivery is an Exceptionally Different Industry. Joe and Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Ryan, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to ask each of you the same first question is really just sharing your story and journey to where you are today. So Ryan, why don't we start?
First, thank you for having us on the podcast today. I started out as a chemical engineer and worked briefly in biotech and moved very quickly into a career in medicine and did my training in Toronto, originally from Canada, and moved to Stanford to do my pulmonary and critical care training. And always had wanted to bring the engineering and medicine into a career, and got involved in the program in biodesign at Stanford, which is a health technology program focused on value and need-driven innovation. And did that postdoc, was involved in 3 projects that became companies and technologies, 2 of them more traditional medical devices in the critical care and women's health space, and one of which was a business that I'm still actively involved in as a CEO, focused on improving serious illness and end-of-life care. So my life today is partially in this company that's called Vinca, and partially practice medicine 1 day a week still in a role at Stanford.
Well, it's good to hear. A fellow Canadian. I'm from Toronto, Canada as well. So I always like to ask CEO physicians this question. Has being a physician, Ryan, has that helped or hurt you as a CEO?
I think it's overwhelmingly helped, I would say, and particularly having a small toe in the water of clinical medicine. There's not a clinic that goes by where I don't bring some insight about something that's relevant to our business back that's helpful. And that might be learning from a patient interaction. It might be something that's changed in terms of how we're delivering care, a new compliance issue that's come up, a new opportunity to see change on the horizon. So for me, it's been really helpful. But I will say that I think there is a need to kind of separate those roles and functions. And what I mean by that is that I think there is a requisite humility that has to come with that. You're not by any means the smartest person in the room as a physician. And I think if you approach it from a humble point of view, you can bring those learnings back into your role on the executive side.
Imagine, if you will, an interventional cardiologist being humble, right? All the traits that a great CEO has. Sometimes, as long as the physician understands his or her limitations, they can be very value add.
And Joe, I'm going to ask you that same question. You are a venture capitalist, so tell me your story and journey to where you are today.
My first exposure to healthcare was as a medic in the United States Army, and then as an officer, where I was the aide-de-camp to a major general who was the commanding general of Walter Reed Army Medical Center, which at the time was an 1,100-bed hospital. He was an extraordinary human being. I learned a great deal about him. And I learned a great deal on how he effectively managed this large institution. Following that, I knew I wanted to stay in healthcare. I was not able to go to medical school, so I was able to get other experiences as an executive in various healthcare companies. So I have led 6 healthcare companies. I have invested in and been on the boards of 20 some odd healthcare companies. And subsequent to that, I thought I'd make it. And I got involved in teaching. I'm a lecturer at Stanford Biodesign. And my writing, which is a hobby, and I love it, I focused on 2 big issues. Number one, the effectiveness and the roles of boards of directors, and the patient experience, having been through recent patient experiences myself, and seeing how my mom, who was 99 at the time, confronted the challenges of the healthcare system.
And Joe, I have a lot of physicians on the show who are interested in the health tech space, and I'm sure you hear many, many pitches. So what's your number one piece of advice to physicians who want to pitch to venture capitalists like yourself? What's your number one piece of advice to these doctors who have a great idea?
For them to surround themselves with domain expertise, right? both on the technical side as well as the leadership side. And sometimes that's difficult for them to do, but I think it's really essential. You have to bring as much credibility to the table as you can. And the practical side of developing a technology or a product is full of challenges that many of them have never encountered.
Now, both of you wrote a series of articles on Kevin MD, very insightful, why healthcare delivery is an exceptionally different industry. Now, Ryan, I'm going to have you summarize these articles for those who didn't get a chance to read it. Maybe you could share also what's the impetus and reason why you and Joe decided to write these series.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the impetus was really some of the conversations that Joe and I have had about our shared experiences as patients or seeing loved ones who are patients navigating the healthcare system. And Joe and I in our day jobs are on the other side of that, right? And we have, it really isn't until you're in that seat or you see some that is around you in that seat navigating that experience that really highlights how terrible a job we often do of providing the basics of an exceptional person-centered experience in healthcare. And the whole system is designed for the providers of care, the other stakeholders, and the patient is often lost in that. And I think the word patient itself is a problem, right? They're people, we're individuals that we're caring for. And our conversations then led to, well, there's a bunch of other industries that are just as complicated as healthcare. There's a bunch of other industries with very kind of complex stakeholder landscapes. And those industries still manage to provide an exceptional experience to their end users, call them customers or whatever that end user is. They've figured out how to create an exceptional experience for that end user. And Joe and I have done a lot of self-reflection on why is this, and why is it, why do we have these dingy waiting rooms, why are we made to wait for 30 minutes, and keyed in on this concept of exceptionalism, I think just from some of the stories that Joe just alluded to around, what are those attitudes of the healthcare system and the healthcare ecosystem that perhaps drive biases in our behaviors that fundamentally have led to these issues, these structural issues in healthcare. So keyed in on a few different aspects of examples of this exceptionalism that we see, one of which, given Joe's expertise in board governance, is around how boards of health systems are typically structured and how in businesses, whether for-profit or nonprofit, outside of health systems, the boards are true stewards and partners in that operation and in guiding and in holding the executive team accountable to operational goals and so on. And in health systems, the board of directors is basically an extension of the foundation typically, right? It's a fundraising function where the individuals around the board are able to bring capital to the table through their positions or networks or otherwise, but don't bring that expertise and that function that a board ought to have that Joe knows so well. The second aspect was around healthcare leadership in general and how we look at health system CEOs. Things like, why do health system CEOs turn over far more rapidly than CEOs in other industries? And what does that lead to from a consequence of leadership, longitudinal success of these healthcare operations? And then the third is around infrastructure and operations and how we enter a hospital and find these dingy waiting rooms, these dingy, awful buildings when somebody's already sick and not feeling well. That's the last place you want to be. You don't want to go down a long hallway that can get lost 5 times. You want to have an experience where you feel comforted and supported. And also along those lines, seeing lack of true investment in healthcare technology, innovation, and infrastructure in that regard. So talk a lot about some of the examples of the consequences of exceptionalism. And our real point with this series of articles is to encourage self-reflection. Encourage self-reflection amongst our community and to check ourselves about these attitudes and to ask ourselves, how we can do better. Because what we are seeing, and this is, some of the other writing that Joe and I have done, is that there are people doing this in the industry today. There are people providing innovative primary care solutions, innovative solutions for other populations. And that is the seed of fundamental disruption in the industry, which is great to see. But those disruptors have taken that individual, that patient that we call today, and they've put them at the center, and they understand their needs, and they address those needs, and they provide a delightful experience for those individuals.
It starts at the top. The leader sets a culture. If you've got a culture of accountability, patient satisfaction, it permeates the entire system, and it forces change in the entire system. If you've got a culture is the way you do things, and if the leader doesn't impose his or her will to create a positive culture, the organization is just not going to work. We cite infrastructure, the layout, and all this. Imagine as a 75-year-old, my dad was looking for the MRI at the Brigham and Women's on Longwood Avenue. Imagine as an individual trying to navigate that kind of a system. Or when you try to check in with the unit clerk and they treat you like dog meat. I mean, you're already in a bad state of mind. You're depressed. You're scared. Why is that? I mean, it's the cheapest, the most effective way to manage by setting a positive culture and having people treat each other with the respect that they deserve. It's really challenging. And until you have a leader willing to acknowledge the problem, but then make a disruptive change, force disruptive change throughout the organization, it's going to stay the same. The other challenge you've got is accountability does not permeate the organization. Okay, they can have the worst financial results year after year. So the CEO gets fired. So what? They bring in a new one, and they may fix certain things in a very reactive way, but it doesn't solve the underlying problem. A great example of, and the other challenge I think is so many organizations have MDs as the CEO. Why is that? Does that mean that non-MDs don't have a clue on how to manage a 1,000-bed institution? I think not. Why is that? Mass General, everybody's got to be an MD. I don't understand that.
I was just going to say, I think the physician executive is totally fine and can do a great job, but that physician executive has to have the requisite background and training for the executive role, and to bring that operational rigor, that accountability, the establishment of goals and KPIs, and that skill set is critical. The MD certainly can add value as an executive, but if you're lacking and not including all of those other things that are so much more important to actually being a great health system CEO, that's a real problem.
We've had this question come up in a podcast before, why should executives and CEOs have or have not an MD? And I think that there's something that someone has called, Pat Fahey, she calls the business school mindset. And sometimes the business school mindset lies in direct tension to what constitute great patient care. So there's an inherent tension there. So ideally, if you have that physician executive, you would have someone with the skills with both the business school mindset, but also the patient care mindset, because if you have one or the other, sometimes that's not going to work.
Although what I will say to that, Kevin, is that I think those things actually work together, because if you have the sort of business school mindset and establish goals and accountability around things like exceptional patient experience, around things like exceptional quality of care, that's great. And that's a great way to institute those changes at a healthcare delivery system. Mm-hmm. The executive and the board and the whole organization have to be aligned that those are priorities, though. And if they're not priorities, then they will suffer. But I would differentiate between the skill set of a business background and the sort of patient experience quality of care implication. I think they're absolutely aligned, and in fact, a great way to ensure high quality and consistent care by applying those business practices to healthcare organizations.
So, Joe, I'm going to draw on your expertise on governance. So, if you were to make changes in terms of how the majority of healthcare systems are governed, from the board of directors to the CEO, what kind of improvements and changes would you make from that perspective?
We talked about in the piece, the New York Press, with all due respect to New York Press, I mean, they have 100-member board. What the hell can they do? I mean, it's got to be like herding cats to try to manage all these really extraordinary, outstanding human beings and executives. But that's not what the institution needs, right? The institution is measured on delivering superior patient care, superior patient experience. They've got patient experience officers with little or no responsibility or accountability. But anyway, the board has got to have those personalities and those skill sets that fill gaps in the institution's the skill sets on this management team, right? I think that's really number one. It's such a huge advantage to be able to get the outstanding human beings willing to serve that will give their time and expertise besides their capital to deliver a better and more efficient organization. I think that's the biggest one. The expertise that the institution does not have in its leadership team can really be supplemented by outstanding human beings from the outside.
We're talking to Joe Mandato and Ryan Van Wert. Joe is a venture capitalist. Ryan is a pulmonary care physician and healthcare executive. Together, they wrote a series of articles on Kevin MD, Why Healthcare Delivery is an Exceptionally Different Industry. So, Joe and Ryan, I know that we can spend many hours talking about this, but we have 5 minutes left. So I'm going to just ask each of you just for your take-home messages and what you would like to see in an ideal world in terms of how we could improve our healthcare delivery system. So, Joe, I'm going to start with you. So, what are some of your take-home messages?
Given that we spend the most per capita on healthcare, and yet our outcomes are not even close to being at the top of the list, we've got to figure a way to do it differently. I think the leader has to drive and be receptive to change. He or she has to be receptive to disruptive new ideas. Pacific Healthcare has a committee, and they've formed the committee, and they call it Getting Rid of Stupid Stuff Program, right? Empower your team members to come up with different, more productive ways of doing things. Another, the University of Melbourne, they came up with 3 recommendations. Prioritize patient and staff safety, right? Number 1. Create a culture of accountability, number 2. And provide proof that new practices can be effective. So again, empowering your organization, getting them involved, getting them engaged, and holding people accountable. Those are my recommendations.
And Ryan, what are some of your recommendations to improve our healthcare delivery system and take-home messages?
Yeah, I totally agree with Joe's thoughts, and I would reflect on some of the comments on the beginning of let's self-reflect on why we're all here, and we're all here in healthcare because there's a mission-driven purpose, and to make sure that we're doing the best we can to achieve that mission. And I think with exceptionalism can come complacency. And my call to action would be to look at those opportunities, self-reflect, and think about those other industries where you as an individual, if you haven't, some of us are fortunate not to have been a patient or not to be a patient often. And if you're in that category, I would say think about other industries where you leave as the customer with just an exceptional experience. And ask yourself why that happened and why that made you feel delighted as a customer. And think about how we can take some of those learnings and put them into healthcare.
Joe and Ryan, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. And thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.